I don't remember what they're called, but no, it's not actually a browser, but yes, it is a browser. All right, thank you everyone for coming. I'm very excited today to talk to you all about how we can build cross-platform Blazor desktop apps with Photino. So I'll just quickly run through the agenda. First up, we're going to take a look at web versus desktop capabilities in general and the benefits of using each of those. Then we'll take a look at some desktop app frameworks. Number 3, spoilers, we'll look at Photino, one of those frameworks. Then we'll get started with an easy template. And then we'll dive in with some code and make an app. And finally publishing that app. First, a bit more about me. My name is Matt Parker. I'm an SSW software engineer too. You can stalk me on my SSW people profile there, or check out my blog where I write about .NET, C#, things like that. A bit more about me. I love coding, C#, .NET, Blazor, and JetBrains IDEs. A small plug here. Rider is now free for non-commercial usage, open source usage. So if you haven't used it before, I recommend you check it out. I'm a motorbike rider, and of course I'm a gamer. And feel free to follow me on my social media there. We also have an SSW rewards app. So if you'd like to scan the QR code to get the app, you can earn points to claim rewards and win prizes. And at the end, there'll be a survey that you can fill out to earn some points. Awesome, so let's jump right into the first section. So web versus desktop app capabilities. So with building an application on the web, you get familiar styling with CSS. Most developers are very familiar with CSS. It's very powerful and somewhat easy to use. It's cross-platform, obviously. There's a browser on every operating system. There's lots of UI frameworks, so you have a lot of variety and a lot of documentation on the internet. This is probably somewhat of a personal preference, but it has URL-based routing, which I prefer a lot more than what you get with a lot of desktop frameworks. A downside, there's no operating system access for the most part. With Chrome, there are some file explorer APIs, but in general, no. And a big one is no multithreading, which means in general, you're blocking the UI thread. Recently, they've introduced web workers, which lets you run some things in a background thread, but there are a lot of limitations. So in general, it's not like proper multi-threading in a desktop context. So jumping over to desktop, it's typically more performant rendering. Of course, it depends. You do get multi-threading, which is great. You do have access to operating system APIs like files or, for example, Windows APIs that you might want to call. It's typically not cross-platform. And typically XAML syntax, which again is a personal preference, but I'm not a huge fan of XAML. And custom routing. So generally you have to build your own kind of nested navigation, which I'm not a huge fan of. Okay, so let's have a look at some desktop app frameworks. These are the 5 we're going to look at today: MAUI, Avalonia, WPF, Electron, and Photino. So let's start on the left. MAUI is not actually cross-platform because it doesn't support Linux. So mostly, but not. Sorry, MAUI. But it is multi-threaded. You do have file system access. You can access operating system APIs. You do get CSS styling if you use a Blazor web view inside MAUI. And it is Blazor syntax if you use a Blazor web view. But I've left them as tildes because it's not the default when you use MAUI. Having a look at Avalonia, it is cross-platform, which is awesome. You do get multi-threading, file system access, OS APIs. There's no CSS styling or Blazor syntax because you can't use Blazor there at all. WPF, very similar to MAUI, except that it's not cross-platform, and at that point, why would you even use it? Just use MAUI. Electron is cross-platform, but there's no multi-threading in general. Again, you could use those web workers, but yeah, it's not great. There is file system access, but you can't access the operating system APIs, and you can use your CSS styling in Blazor syntax because it's just a website running locally. And then we come to Photino, which has all of the above. So to me, the two prime contenders are MAUI and Photino. So let's compare those two. So Photino, it is cross-platform, including Linux, which is awesome, I think. You don't require any XAML. That's a big win. Downside is it's a third-party framework. It's not made by Microsoft. MAUI, it is a Microsoft-supported framework, but you do have to write XAML, and it does not support Linux. And it requires the MAUI.NET workload to be installed, which is not a huge deal, but it's just more friction to getting started. So to me, the clear winner there is Photino. So let's take a look at it. So I might just jump over to their website. Here we are. So this is the Photino's website. Just has some images of what it looks like, links to documentation, explains. You can use other languages like C#, C++, Java, and more. You can use other web UI frameworks if you'd like. Explains sort of how it works. Has some code examples of .NET templates if you want to get started with it. Has a demo kind of tutorial video. And some graphs comparing it to Electron, which is interesting. Alright, so they also have a GitHub organization. Now there's 3 repositories here that we're interested in. The first one is Photino native. So this is basically it's written in C++, the bridge between the web view in the desktop on each operating system and Photino essentially, which so we don't actually need to worry about this repo. The next one is Photino.net, which is the bridge between Photino native and C# essentially. But again, we don't need to worry about that one because we have Photino.Blazor, and that's all we need to use. So, had a look at those. How can we get started with it? So like I said, it's just a NuGet package. This is all you would need to add to your project to get started. They have some nice sample code on their README, which you can check out, and they also have some samples of full code there, which you can look at. There's a few defaults in there that I'm not a huge fan of, so I've made my own template here, which is open public on GitHub if you'd like to take a look at it. Of note, I've also included Blazor just because I find it easy to use, that has good documentation, etc. So I've cloned that for us here, and let's take a look at what it looks like. So I might just run that for us. And here we are in beautiful Rider. As it freezes on me. Okay, run. And here we are running in Photino. This will be very familiar for anyone who's used Blazor. It's very, very familiar. Cool, so we're ready to get started. So we've got our template running. So now we need to make a new Git repository. And I guess at this point, I should probably explain the application we're going to make. So we're going to make a directory statistics application. Basically, let's say I have a large hard drive that's getting really full and I'd like to find out where all the big files are and sort those to the tops and be able to explore them and find where those really large files are. So that's something like what we're going to make today. So I've made our new Git repository and here we are in the program file. So I'll just point out a few things. So here, using our NuGet package that we have, here's our NuGet package, here's Blazor. We use the Photino Blazor app builder.create default. Looks very similar to how you'd set up an ASP.NET Core project. Add logging, I believe that's for Photino. Add our mod services. And here we have a bunch of properties that Photino exposes for us that we can use to configure our application. So set the size of the window, if you want to enable dev tools, log verbosity, title, etc. There's a bunch of other things on here as well that are quite useful. Pretty much everything you'd want or need. Cool. And this is part of their sample. It's just how they display a pop-up if an unhandled exception occurs, basically. And then app.run. And then the other thing to point out is just our Blazor home.razor. So that's what we saw here. So here we are running and we're ready to go. Cool. We had a look at those. All right, so we're ready to make our app. Let's dive in. So for reference, this is something like what we want to make. There's our file explorer down the side. So it's a list of directories with navigable nested folders. And we'd like to display the total size of each folder and a percentage of the whole hard drive usage, basically. So let's make a new file called directory stats. Over here, and we're going to add a new mud link, which is added to our nav menu on the side here. We're also going to make some new classes. So we need a way to represent the data that we're going to extract from our hard drive, basically. So we have folders and files. So we're going to store the path of the folder and the name of the folder, and then a list of each folder's subfolders and a list of that folder's files. So you can see there that folders is going to recursively contain children, basically. And just a class there to represent our file. And we also are going to need a way to map the hard drive. So I've written a little class called treeMapper, which has a method called getSubfolders, which returns a list of folders for a folder, which I've just stubbed out. And we also are going to add a method to our directory stats.razor file. So this is a Blazor lifecycle method on initialized async, which is where we can just run some code when a view is initialized, essentially. So we're going to get the root path of our hard drive. We're going to make a new folder object, set that to root folder, and then call our recursive getSubfolders method. Cool. So we now need to write the logic for getting our subfolders. And this, of course, is confusing because it's recursive. But we're just going to make a new directory info, which is a .NET class, which represents a directory. We're going to enumerate that directory to get a list of its directories. And then for each of those directories, we're going to make a new folder. We're going to get the subfolders for each of those subfolders and add it. Confusing, it works. And we also need a method to get the files in that folder. So very similar, enumerate the files in the directory, create a new tree map file for each of those and return it. And we'll just add that into our get subfolders method. One thing to point out here, so the way we're going to represent files for us to be able to display them nicely in the UI, we're going to put all the files in a pseudo folder, which isn't a real folder, but it just lets us group them together in a parent folder. So that's what we're doing here. It means I've also added a new property called isPseudoFolder, which is true here, which I've added to our class. Cool. And one more thing we need to do is a way to get the total size of a folder. So we're just going to add a calculated property and a method here, one that basically sums all of the files in a folder as well as all of its subfolders, which will walk all the way down, and also get percentage of root folder size. So you pass in a total size, it will calculate what percentage it is. Simple enough. Cool. So I think we're ready to run it. Let's run it and see what happens. Bear with me. Okay. So if we run our app now, we see that it explodes with our lovely red bar in Blazor that we all love. So let's jump into the console and see what the error is. Okay, access to some random path is denied. So because I'm not running this as an administrator, and even then, there are some folders that you don't have access to. So all we need to do is add a try catch around our enumeration code, basically. So let's add that. Very simple, and the same for our files. Okay, we've done most of the hard stuff. We're ready to make our UI, which is the fun part. Cool, so I guess now we want a way to, let's run it and see where we're up to. All right, you'll notice that the UI has now frozen when I've clicked on my nav menu item, and it looks like it's blown up completely. And the reason for that is we're doing a whole pile of CPU intensive work here that's blocking the thread from our UI thread, that makes sense that it's blown up. So all we need to do to fix that is wrap this in a task.run, which essentially tells it to run in a background thread. So all we need to do, change this to await task.run this. Oh, it's mad at me because it needs to be a lambda. There we go, and let's see what happens now. Okay, cool. It hasn't frozen, so we've solved that problem. So I guess now we'd like to show the user that something's happening instead of just a blank screen. So let's add a loading spinner that displays while it's working. So let's add a mud progress linear circular. Indeterminate just means it will spin forever. One thing to point out, hot reload works with Photino, which is awesome. So I guess now we'd like it to only show when it's actually doing something. So let's add a new field called isLoading. Cool, and so right before we do our work, we'll say isLoading is true. Thank you, Copilot. And once it's finished, it's false. Cool. So trust me, bro, it's working. We're not going to sit here and wait for it to finish just yet. Cool. So we also would like to probably know how long it takes to run. So let's add a way to display that for the user. So let's add a stopwatch. Sure. And again, right before it starts, start the stopwatch. Once it's finished, stop the stopwatch. And we'd like to display that to the user. So let's say, oh, I haven't put this in an isLoading. So it would work, but we only want that to the spinner to show when it's loading. So there we go. That's okay, and you can see it's disappeared because it's finished. Okay, so our stopwatch, we'd only like that to show once it's finished. So we can use a return statement here, which is very cool. In Blazor, you can have early returns in your UI, which I like. Now let's add a mud text, and we can put in here stopwatch elapsed milliseconds. And so that means this isn't going to render unless isLoading is false. And this is what the Photino error looks like in that pop-up window I mentioned before. So let's just restart it. Cool, let's let that go. So we fixed that up. Ah, cool. So it's finished in 18 seconds. Let's quickly add a title to make this page look a little bit less horrendous. Vectory statistics. And let's make it a heading. Cool. Awesome. All right. So this is quite slow, 20 seconds. I don't want to sit here and wait 20 seconds for this thing to run. So how can we speed this up? This is single threaded. What's the best way to fix performance every time? Just throw more threads at it. So let's give that a whirl. So all we need to do that is hop into our tree mapper class. And instead of synchronously iterating through our subfolders, we can do that in a parallel.forEach. So parallel for each. Let's see if Copilot can figure this out for me. If my delete key would work. Well, yeah, that looks kind of like something. So Copilot's going to use a lock here, which I'm not going to use. So let's get rid of that. But we do need to be aware that we are accessing a list from multiple threads, which is not thread safe. So we need to turn this into a concurrent bag. If I could spell. Oh, geez. There we go. And anywhere that we're returning it, we need to to-list it. Cool, and don't forget to take out the old synchronous for each. To-list. Okay, let's run that and see how long it takes. Wow, 8.5 seconds. So we've a bit over or under halved how long it took to run, which is a pretty good improvement, I think. So I'm pretty happy with that. So we have done that. Cool. So in my testing, it took roughly 8.5 seconds, which is a 59% reduction, or 2.4 times faster. Cool. So now I'm going to quickly cache that result to a JSON file just for our demo's purposes. I'd rather not make us all sit here for 8 seconds every time we want to iterate on the UI. So I'll just quickly go through this, but it's not super important. So I've made a new app state class. It has a folder. We're going to load that folder in our onInitialized method. And here back in our program class, I've added some methods to get the config file path to load it. And one other thing to point out, so Photino has a register window closing handler, so it basically lets you run some code when Photino's exiting. So even if you click the X button in the corner, it's still going to run this code. So that's where I've added some code to save our state to that file. Cool. All right, we're now going to add a table to our UI to display the data that we've gotten. So we've added a mud table. You pass it a list of items. We've given it an array containing our root folder. We made it dense, which just makes it smaller. So we can define header content, which just says what is the column headers, what is in those, and a row template, which is saying how would you like the data to appear for each row. And so we've just used the name of the folder, the total folder size. I've left this percentage empty for now, and the final one is get that percentage of the root folder size. And if we run that, it will look something like this. Cool. So we also want to display what that size looks like as a visualization. So again, we can add another mud progress, this time linear, and we can give it a value. So the total folder size, and a maximum, which is the root folder total folder size, and a color. And Blazor does everything else for me. And so I've got a bar there that represents how much of the total hard drive does that folder represent. And obviously C drive is 100%. Cool. This size is a bit ugly to look at, so let's format that nicely. I'm going to pull in a NuGet package called bytesize, which is easy to use. All we need to do is add a bytesize property on our class folder, our folder class, and say bytesize from bytes. So take in an integer or a long containing the number of bytes, and it will turn it into the object. And that lets you call properties on it with it already formatted for you, which is cool. And using that, it will look something like this. So 533.7 gigabytes. Cool. So now we'd like to display the subfolders of the root folder. So Blazor gives us an easy way to do that as well with something called the child row content. So it's basically a section that you can use where you could display expandable content. Say you've got addresses and you'd like to show address details for a row. You could somehow expand that. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to basically copy paste the existing table, but we need to rename the context for Blazor, and it'll give us something like this. Of note, the columns are funky, but overall it looks like it's working. So let's fix up those problems. Yes. So I'm going to run that now. Let's see what it looks like. Right here. And the lights have just gone off in the office. Cool, so you'll notice again the UI is kind of hanging there a little bit, even though it's loading the result from the JSON. And the reason for that is because we have our calculated properties and method on our function, on our folder, sorry, these are going to be calculated every time they're accessed. So you can imagine how many hundreds of thousands of files and folders you have. Every time it's walking down that, it's going to recalculate it. So to fix that, we just need to store it, basically calculate it once and store it in a backing field. So that's super easy. All we need to do is add the backing field and essentially change the property to either get that, or if it's null, if it hasn't been calculated yet, then calculate it. So we've done that for the total folder size, the percentage, and our byte size classes and property. Cool, so that will fix that up. Now we'd like to fix that formatting in the table. And I've done this slightly early. So this, I've refactored the so Blazor has something called col group, which lets you define how the columns look and are width spaced out, basically. So I've refactored that to be reusable because you'll notice we've used this again in our subtable. I've aligned some text, and the big one is this table data colspan 4. So if you remember, the data was all jammed in the first column of the root folder. So that will let it spread over all 4 of them. So I've abstracted this to a render fragment. I'll come back to render fragments, because they're pretty cool. But this is what it looks like. Just define 4 columns and you can set some styles on them. So I've defined the widths of those. Cool. And doing that, we get this, which I think looks pretty good so far. Now it'd be nice if it sorted it in descending order of size, which is, again, super easy to do using link, probably one of my favorite parts of .NET. So we just order the subfolders by descending on the total folder size. And ta-da, look at that. Beautiful. Now let's also add a folder icon. Let's actually do this. Oops. Cool. So here with our name, we'd like to also display an icon, which luckily for us, Blazor has a component for called MudIcon, and it's trying to suggest. So we can set the icon to icons material filled folder. We can set a color. So let's say warning, and let's set the size to small. That's going to restart. Cool, that looks good. We've now got a folder there. The styling's a little bit funky, so let's put it in a mud stack, which is essentially a display flex container. Let me just say row. Oops. Row true. Cool, that looks better. We also need to add the folder for our parent, the root folder. Cool, that looks good. Ooh. Wonderful. So we also want to display a different icon for files because they're not a folder and it looks kind of weird. Some of you will see where I've taken inspiration for this design, but let's add that. Whoops. Where is writer gone? So all we need to do let's just, this will be just you watching me type. So we can simply just have a ternary expression for if it's a pseudo folder, and then we can just change which property, well, what is set to the icon property. So if it's a pseudo folder, meaning it contains files, we set it to a square rather than a folder. And the same for the color. We set it to dark versus yellow. And that will look like this. So there's our files pseudo folder, which contains 35 gigabytes of stuff. So you're probably thinking, Matt, how are you going to display all of those subfolders nested all the way down? Are you just going to keep copying and pasting your table all the way down? Well, no. We're going to use our beautiful friend recursion to display that. And to facilitate that, we're going to refactor our folder table to another render fragment. So this is what it looks like. So render fragments are somewhat like components, somewhat. It lets you define some reusable view UI code for a component. Of note, you don't have to worry about bindings because it's all running in the same context of this component. But that's just going to let us display a folder. So you see we can pass in a folder and that'll display this table. Cool. So we need a way to, obviously if I just ran this and tried to display every single folder on my hard drive, it'd probably explode. So I'm not going to even try, but we can add a way to expand each folder that we'd like to. So to do that, we'll add a new property on our folder class called expanded. And we can now simply add some logic to our child row content inside our render fragment to say if that bool is true, if it's expanded, then display the get folder table. And you'll notice this get folder table is the function that it's in. So this is our recursive UI logic. So we'd also like to, we need a way to toggle that boolean. So again, simple. We add a mud toggle icon. We can bind it to the expanded property. Again, of note, yep, we've added some property size, an icon, and an icon when it's toggled. So arrow right, arrow drop down. Cool, and that will look like this. So let's run that. Bear with me. Oops. Awesome. Here we are. So we've got our toggle icon, and you can see when we click that, we are going down our directories. And you can see here where I've stored the config file for this, the cache, 300 megabytes. Awesome. So we've added a toggle, letting us go down our folders. And we can expand it. All right, we're nearly done. We're nearly there. So we also need a way to, if you note here, when I click files, it doesn't do anything. We need to a way to display the files if it's a pseudo folder. So pretty simple. We're going to add a get file table method. Again, it looks very similar to get folder table. There are just a few things that are different. And we need to modify our get folder table. So all we need to do, check if it's a pseudo folder, then display the get file table. Otherwise, display the get folder table. Super simple. And there we are. That's what it looks like. A little bit weird styling, so let's fix that up. So we need a way to essentially indent the folders more and more as the nesting increases. So how I did that, I added another property on my folder called depth, which we can very easily increment as we go further down the tree. So there we are. The depth is the folder that it's currently in +1. Easy. And so I've done a bit of a hack here. I think it works well. Some people may not like it. I've simply set the margin left to the folder depth times 29 pixels. I figured out what looked the nicest, 29 and then pixels. And ignore the fact that there's a mud toggle button in a file table. There's obviously not an expand on a file, but I've just used that so the styling all lines up properly, and I've made it invisible there, which is a mud Blazor helper CSS class. Cool, and that's what it looks like. Awesome, so I think that's pretty usable. You could find where your large files are there. And we can see it goes to a bunch of depths. One more thing. So I noticed when I was building this that the total hard drive size didn't actually line up with what was reported in Windows. And that's because by default, enumerate directories includes symbolic links, which don't actually exist on the hard drive. Like there could be 10 symbolic links, but the file only exists once. So we just need to filter that out. So that's easy to do. All we need to do is pass in some properties or some arguments to enumerate directories. And the main part to note here is the file attributes.reparse point. That means symbolic links. Why they couldn't have just called it symbolic links. And we're done. Whew. Our UI is built. So, how can we now publish the app that we have made? Well, it's very easy. You just clone my template and run localpublish.bat and you're done. Now, obviously that doesn't work on Linux or Mac. So the total contents of that bat file is that one line .NET publish, which is pretty awesome. And there it is running. And this is the result of that publish. So all you need here is the exe file and the www root folder. So of note, typically when you publish a project, it would have all of the DLLs that are needed there just in that folder. So you'd probably have 100 items there. So these are some of the properties, or these are the properties that let us have those all be inside the exe file. So it's much nicer. So publish single file is the main one. And this is the default that I was talking about, the Photino sets, which I don't like, which is self-contained true. By setting it to true, it includes the whole .NET runtime inside the file, which makes it about 80 megabytes compared to our 12 megabytes. So that'll be up to you to decide if it's a developer tool and you know everyone's already going to have the .NET runtime installed. I'd probably set it to false. There are definitely times when you'd want it to be true. And include native libraries for self-extract is just related to the published single file. Cool, and we're done. And here it is running on Windows. And here it is running on Mac OS. And here it is on Linux. I promise I took all of these screenshots. This was actually running in WSL, which is pretty cool that you can run this even on Windows through WSL. It was a bit of a pain to set up, but I don't think that's Photino's fault. I think that's WSL's fault. Cool. All right, in summary, we had a look at web versus desktop capabilities, some desktop app frameworks. We had a look at Photino, how we can get started, and an easy template. We wrote some code to make our application, and then we looked at how we can publish that app. If you have feedback for today's session, I'd love to hear it. I'm constantly improving this talk, so I'd love if you filled out the survey, which you can earn 800 SSW reward points for doing so, using this QR code. So thank you. Are there any questions?
Why didn't you take into account React Native or anything like that, like Flutter and whatnot? They can also do desktop.
Yeah. Yes. So the question from the audience was, why didn't I look into React Native or Flutter, things like that? This was generally like if you want to use C# and if you want to use Blazor, essentially. Yeah. So I wasn't even considering those. Yeah. Do we have any questions from online? We've got another question from the audience.
Is it still actually running a browser and V8 engine and stuff like that?
That's a great question. The question was, is it still running a browser and a V8 engine, essentially? The answer is no, it's not a browser. It's a web view. So it uses the native web view from each operating system. So on Windows, that's the web view 2. On, I don't remember what they're called, but no, it's not actually a browser, but yes, it is a browser. But it's not running Blazor WebAssembly. It's Blazor, the Blazor web view. So essentially what runs if it was running in MAUI, which means it's multi-threaded. Yeah. Another question.
Does Photino support mobile panel?
Not currently, no. So the question was, does Photino support mobile? The answer is not currently. Let's just have a look at their docs. I believe they, yeah, so what's next? They would like to support iOS and Android, which would be cool, but not currently. Yeah. Yes, Sam?
When you're doing cross-platform work, so things like the title bar in your Mac app, how easily accessible are things like that from Photino?
As in, the question was about the title bar and how accessible things are.
Yeah.
Do you mean like the title and icons?
Yeah, so in Windows, if I want to change the title bar to pink, I can do whatever I need to do. In Mac OS, that's going to be different. In Linux, that's going to be different. Like that will be native code for you to write.
Yeah. Let me just jump into their config. So I don't think you can customize much about the native title bars. You can set the title and an icon. But if you want to, you can create your own title bar completely. So set chromeless means it just removes the title bar, and you can make your own.
Pretty similar to MAUI.
Yeah, which is cool. Yeah. Cool. All right, awesome. Thank you, everyone.